Managing Director of Starbucks Coffee, Australia and New Zealand, and Head of Operations for Weight Watchers in the Asia Pacific. She has a passion for developing leaders by providing them with exciting growth opportunities through experiential learning and executive mentoring. So without further ado, let me now hand over the time to Ms. Aasha Murthy to begin the talk. Ms. Aasha, please.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever in the world you are, we have people joining from multiple time zones today. So thank you all for coming in and sharing your time. We hope you're safe. We hope you're well, wherever you are, under very difficult circumstances. So we ourselves are broadcasting to you live from the central coast of New South Wales in Australia, about an hour and a half from Sydney. It's 8 o'clock in the night for us, but it is wonderful that we are all able to connect at a time like this. And, while we don't have the physical human connection, it is still wonderful to connect with so many people from around the world. So today this is going to be a chat. This is going to be like a fireside chat. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, we want to just cover off some of the key ideas from our book. And then we'll take some questions at the end. So I would suggest you kind of settle down with your cup of coffee or your glass of wine or a cup of hot cocoa where it's very, very late. I know some of you, it's past your bedtime, and some of you, it's not even your waking time. So we appreciate the fact that you're able to join us. And like I said, let's get going and talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we've put forward in the book.
Great. So on that happy note, I'm going to jump right in. So there are a couple of questions that people normally ask us about the book. So the very first question is, why did you call it Being? And that is a pretty pertinent question, given that most of us are always busy doing stuff. And that's because I think evolution sets us up for doing things, because evolution sets us up for success. So it gets us to do stuff, so we are competitive. And so we get locked into these zero-sum games where we win and somebody else loses, and somebody wins and we lose. But really, if you look at life, existence is more than just winning or losing. It's about being happy and being connected to the circle of life. And the moment you talk about happiness, you talk about purpose, you're talking about being. So there you go. Otherwise, each one of us would be called human doings. And I think there's a little hint there that human beings is what we are about. So the book's called Human Beings, it's being. So that's question one out of the way. Question two that people often ask both of us is, why a book on leadership now, And there again, it's a really good question because I've got a really good answer. So, when you look at leadership as a practice or a theory or a model, there are lots of theories out there because it's a very well-furrowed field, There's lots of stuff being written about leadership, researched about leadership, practice about leadership. So every sector has its favorite. You ask the army and it's all about situational leadership. You ask a not-for-profit and it's all about relational leadership. You ask organizations and they talk about transformational leadership. And you ask religious institutions and they talk about servant leadership. Where we are today, and given that we're going to talk about the iConnected paradigm and the massive turbulence that we are seeing, it is not that these theories are incorrect. It's just that they are incomplete. So we tried to write a book on leadership that augmented whatever there was and also added a lot of stuff into it from a variety of disciplines. So there you go.
So what are we going to cover today in today's talk? So the first thing we're going to talk about is our own worldview, and go through the guiding canons from our perspective, the guiding canons that actually have shaped this book. The second thing we're going to do is talk about this iConnected world, this new paradigm. What is this iConnected world? What are its characteristics? What are the challenges? And then we're going to talk about, therefore, what is the mindset that you need to have as a leader? So what is a leader's futures mindset and the dimensions of that mindset? And finally, we're going to touch on the 5 ways of being, which describe the virtues, the enactments, and the actions that bring this to life. So there's a fair bit that we have to cover. We have covered in the book, as you probably all know. It's a very, very extensive, a big piece of work. But today we're going to just cover some of the big ideas that we've gone through, but we want to start with the guiding canons, because I think it is very important for you to understand where we are coming from in terms of writing this book.
So there are 5 guiding canons that kind of describe our worldview, our mindset as we've gone into writing this book. And I want to cover a few, and Asha will cover the rest. So the very first one is that leadership is virtuous. This is not a book about Hitler or Pol Pot. This is a book that very clearly says that leadership is virtuous because it's out to achieve authentic consequences, because it depends on practices that are morally uplifting, and bulwarking these practices that are morally uplifting are actions that are credible. And are credible, why? Because they are fashioned in the crucible of strong character. So the first thing is that leadership, as we see it, is about your better angels. The second guiding canon that we are looking at is that leadership is purposeful. Aristotle, about 2,300 years ago, wrote this thing called the Nicomachean Ethics. And what he says is still true, What he says is that, of course, leadership should be virtuous. It should be about your character strength. It should be about wisdom and courage and humanity and justice and transcendence and temperance and all those beautiful things. But all those things just give you a ticket to the ballpark. Once you're in the ballpark, you must pick up the rhythm of the dance and then choose to dance. So what we're saying here is that leadership is A, virtuous, and B, it's purposeful. Whenever you get the chance, you must dance. The third one.
The third canon that we talk about is the beginner's mind. We all talk about this, to have a clean slate, to have the curiosity of a child, a beginner's mind. But that's not so, it is quite difficult to have a beginner's mind because we are experts. We have been successful. But the beginner's mind, there are lots of possibilities. And an expert's mind, there are very few. Because expertise is, by definition, is somebody who's an expert at yesterday's problems. So when it comes to a turbulent world, a changing world, having a beginner's mind is critical. Because the ability to unlearn, the ability to let go is far more important than the ability to learn even. Because that is what you need when the world is changing so rapidly. We often say this, temporary incompetence is a very good thing. And it shouldn't be permanent, of course, but temporary incompetence, the ability to say, I don't know, the ability to say, I have no idea, but I will check out and do something. And that's what we're talking about, the beginner's mind. So that's a huge part of what we've covered in the book. The fourth canon is alert attention is the mother of all intelligence. We all think we are very good at multitasking, and the world expects us to multitask. So we think we're doing multiple things at once, but it's very, very clear. I mean, all the research, all the neuroscience tells us that when you multitask, we're actually doing multiple things not very well. So we're actually suboptimal when we're trying to do two or more things at the same time. And why is that? Because there are a couple of things, couple of points there. One is because when you're moving from one task to the other, there is what we call switching costs. I mean, oftentimes you have a to-do list in the morning and you start doing your task for the day and something happens, something urgent. So immediately you need to move to that task. But there is a switching cost because you're still operating with the rules of the first task while you've gone to the second one. The second one is what we call attention residue, meaning that while you're actually moving from this task to the other one, there is still a residue of the earlier tasks. So for both of those reasons, you're doing two or more things not very well, or you are suboptimal. So the best way to get best outcomes is with deep engagement.
And finally, the fifth canon, the guiding canon for us, is this definition of what is the meaning of reality. You know, there's this guy called Sylvan Tompkins, and he once said that there are just two kinds of people in this world. One that believes the world needs to be discovered, that it exists already, quite separate from our experience of it. And it's got its own properties, its own categories, its own characteristics, and all we need to do is discover this world. And there is the other that believes that knowledge, reality, understanding, everything is fashioned when we interact with the world, when we experience it and go ahead to make sense of our experience. So one end is what you often call the scientific mind, the scientist. And the scientist believes that, hey, the best way to find out this world is the scientific method. And what is the scientific method predicated on? It's predicated on rationality. Don't let your emotion into it. Don't let personal bias into it. Don't. And then you'll get universal laws. On the other hand, the romantic, this other guy who says, hey, the only way you can understand reality is by interacting with the world and making meaning of your experience. The romantic says, hey, we need to have emotion. We need to engage with our prejudices. We need to construct our reality from our social constructs, our backgrounds, etc. Now, each of these are polar opposites, How do you bring these together? Because that's one of the big challenges that Asha and I had. How do you bring the scientist's mind and the romanticist mind together? And the way to do it is by this thing called the social construction of reality, which is that says, objective reality. Because, for sure, where you're sitting in front of your computer right now, the computer exists, so that's objective reality. But then social construction says objective reality and your subjective interpretation of your experience with that objective reality defines what it is that you experience. The third part in that cascade that Asha put up for you, the first part was obviously about the canons. The second part that we're going to talk about now is paradigms. Why? Because we are saying that you're going to be in a different paradigm, that the iConnected paradigm is a brand new space. So I'll just give you a little primer on paradigms, and pardon me because I know all of you are experts in paradigms. God knows we have lived through a few this last 6-8 months. But what is a paradigm? And probably Joel Barker, in the 90s talked a lot about paradigm, and I think I'm going to borrow from him. So a paradigm is nothing but a set of rules, procedures, routines, a model, a pattern, which defines two things. Number one, it describes the edges, the boundaries of the world that you're engaged with. And number two, it tells you how you can be successful in the world in problem solving using the rules of that world. All right. So what a paradigm does is that it sets up a bunch of your assumptions. It says, okay, I believe that XYZ. Moment you do that, and that's why that little picture out there, I hope you can see it. Moment you have assumptions, what those assumptions do is that they get you to expect something. So that poor sword is jumping off a stool, and his expectation is that those guys behind them are going to hold him. All right. Now, one of the big things with paradigms, is that it makes it very, 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 very hard to see stuff and accept disconfirming data. Because anything that falls outside the paradigm, your mind just shuts to it. That is the paradigm effect. So you're just unable to even consider stuff that is right there in front of your face, but that doesn't stick with your paradigm's rules. And when the paradigm effect gets baked in, you have what is called paradigm paralysis, which is that you're just not able to change. You can smell the coffee, you can hear the kettle boiling, your stomach's rumbling, but you still can't get there. All right. One of the big problems with paradigms is because as paradigms start changing and the people in those paradigms, don't change, problems start accumulating. Why? Because these are problems that the paradigm's rules are able to tackle. These are what are called intractable problems. Over to the iConnected paradigm.
So if you looked at the paradigm that it was what we call the industrial paradigm. And that industrial paradigm was there for many, many, many years. And that's a paradigm was beautiful. And I've worked, and we've worked in large multinationals who believed that vertical integration, owning the value chain, these were all the sources of competitive advantage. And so this paradigm existed for a long time. Bureaucracy is the killer app. There's process, there's best practice, all of those sorts of things, operational manual. We've all been in organizations that have them. That was the paradigm. But when we talk about the iConnected paradigm, the paradigm we're in today, now today's world, there is ubiquitous connections. There's radical relatedness and unbounded collaboration, which has led to the rise of the individual. So today's inhabitant of today's world, this iConnected world, is the digital native. We have vibrant online communities. It's a renaissance on amateurism. So it's a very different world. So when you look at some of the brands that have actually not been able to make it, the Sonys, the Kodaks, the Nokias. 10 years ago, Nokia was worth 10 times what it's worth today. So what happened? It's not that they didn't have resources. It's just that they were playing with the old rules when the rules had actually changed. So when you've got the paradigm shift, your need to adapt is very important. It's very important that you understand that the rules have changed, because it's not resources that drives success. When there's a paradigm shift, it's resourcefulness. So when you look at the iConnected paradigm, it is a very, very different paradigm. And what we're going to talk about in a minute is what are the characteristics and therefore the challenges that it brings.
So one of the big background characteristics of this iConnected paradigm is this whole area of adaptiveness. You know, when you ask the average CEO, when you ask the average leader, when you ask the average individual, you know, are you adaptive? The answer is always a resounding yes. That, you know, I'm as nimble, I can turn on a dime. But all the evidence shows that people, when it comes to change, people are deeply unmotivated. People are very slow and crisis driven. People are paradigm blind. And people end up being better problem solvers than really creative solution finders. The ability to ask deep questions, be prepared to listen to deep answers, etc., doesn't exist. So with that as the background, what are some of our challenges and why does the iConnected paradigm become so different? So the first, of course, is this thing called the VUCA world. The world we live in today is volatile. The rate and speed and intensity and magnitude of change is just breathtaking. It's very unpredictable. You cannot, with any degree of precision, actually call anything that's going to happen even 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks from now. It's very complex. You know, you're unable to find cause and effect for all the threats and opportunities that you face, either in your work or in your life or in your love. It's just impossible because threats and opportunities have so many connections and interconnections of cause and effect. And finally, ambiguity. Increasingly, we as human beings are unable to make meaning of the stuff that's happening to us. And multiple perspective taking becomes really, really tough. So that's the VUCA world. And compounding this VUCA world is a second big issue, which is global risk. You know, there's this thing called the World WEF, you know, World Economic Forum, and that releases every year for the last 14 years. You know, it's been putting out this beautiful report on the 10 global risks that this world faces. Actually, they go to 37 and then distill it down to about 10. Now, here's the interesting thing, that every single risk mentioned there, you know, are going to be life limiting. Why? Because they're interconnected, they're intersectional, they are rising trajectories. And worst of all, because there is so much turbulence in political and global convergence between countries and between geographies, and because many of these crises need shared responses, intelligent responses, and trustworthy responses, we are going to hell in a handbasket.
On that nice note, talk about millennials, which is, we talk about the characteristics of the iConnected paradigm. You know, it's a VUCA world with great degree of global risk, but the key demographic that inhabit this world are the millennials. And the millennials are very different in terms of their profile to other generations, the Gen Y, baby boomers, etc. So what is so different about millennials? I think the key difference with millennials is that they have multiple identities. They define themselves in a very nuanced way. It's not just gender or race or religion or or orientation or any of those things is a multitude of those things. And at different times, different things come to the fore. So the millennials define themselves in much more nuanced, much more layered ways than generations before them. And that's an important thing to keep in mind if you're a leader in this generation. The next characteristic I want to talk about is social media. Now, social media, as we all know, and we are all users of social media, and right now we're all on Zoom and we use other platforms, etc. But there are three key parts of social media that I want to cover off. And the first one is about this addiction to attention. Now, we all know, that it is something that young people are particularly interested in, but most of us are, how many connections do you have on LinkedIn? How many friends do you have? How many likes did you get? How many times were your tweets retweeted? How many followers do you have? Now, it's become a bit of an addiction. And what happens with that? Of course, then you start to do more and more to get more and more attention. But what's an even more disturbing development is as you keep pushing things more and more, in order to get the more likes and the more shares, you do stuff that's more and more different from who you actually are. So for young people in particular, it is a real challenge of managing what might become a morphed identity, which might be actually quite different from who they actually are. And that is what this addiction to attention brings in. The second part of social media is this post-truth world. And we all hear this term. Now, post-truth in normal English would mean after the truth, but that is not what post-truth actually means. It means that truth has become irrelevant. It's opinion that rules the day. It isn't truth anymore. Facts don't matter. And leading from post-truth is this area of fake news. Today, you have fully fleshed narratives which are entirely false. And yet, a prurient audience will believe it. You can say anything convincingly with a great degree of fervor, and people will believe it, even though it might be completely false. So if you think about, just to complete this iConnected paradigm, we're talking about a world which is significantly different from the one that we grew up in, our parents grew up in, and certainly our grandparents. We're talking about a world that is moving extremely fast. And if you don't believe me, just think about what happens on 1 minute on the internet. 180 million emails are being sent in just 1 minute as we actually are talking here. We have 1.1 million people logging onto Facebook, 1.5 million swipes on Tinder. Can you imagine that? God knows how many right now, but anyway. So this is the world we're talking about. We're talking about a world that is moving so fast, and it's iConnected because it's all about us as individuals and our little worlds. Each of us have our own news feeds. We have our own newsfeed, people we like, own Spotify lists, own YouTube channels. So really, in our little world, if something doesn't happen, which doesn't come into our little world, it may not have happened. So that is what we call the iConnected world. It is the rise of the individual.
And so there's the agony and the ecstasy of being in this iConnected paradigm. And the agony, of course, all of you know, there is a virus that jumps a species, and within 30 days, we are at the start of something that the world has never encountered before. And all those pictures there are basically tracing for you how something can go so horribly wrong in such a short time, simply because you've got geopolitical turbulence, multilateralism is dying, and suddenly every country is for itself. But unfortunately, the problem requires a global response. The ecstasy is also the renaissance of amateurism, as Asha was saying just now. Today, if one of you has an idea, and I'm sure many of you are entrepreneurs of that ilk, that if one of you has an idea, you don't need an organization behind you to make that idea a flash reality. You can go put your design on 3D. You can cut a prototype. You can take that prototype and get crowdfunding for it. You can take that crowdfunding and get somebody to custom manufacture your product. You can then use a platform to advertise it and another platform to fulfill it. Wow, the rise of the digital native.
So, having described the iConnected world, which, as I said before, it is ubiquitous connections, radical relatedness, and unbounded collaboration. Clearly, if you're a leader in this world, whether you lead a family, a community, a country, you need to have a different mindset, and you need to have a futures mindset. But the future itself is not 10 years away, not 10 months away. It's happening as we speak, as I just talked about a minute on the internet. So given that world, you need to have a different mindset. And we believe there are 3 key dimensions to that mindset. The first one is about focused attention, collaborative spirit, and collective wisdom. So I'm going to very quickly cover off focused attention, and Vikram will talk about the other 2. So we understand what is this mindset. What are the 3 dimensions of this futures mindset? Given that we are in an iConnected world, we need to continue to remember that, because we don't lead in a vacuum. We lead in a world, and today's world is the iConnected world. So whatever you lead, you need to understand that. And anybody who's led would know that context is everything. So these dimensions are particularly significant for the world we're in. So the first one is about focused attention. And I want to make 3 key points under focused attention. The first one is that in the theater of life, what gets lit gets lived. What does that mean? It means that whatever you spotlight, whatever you shine the light on, is what actually happens or becomes an experience in your life. If you look at our working memory, we can process 110 bits of information in 1 second. Me talking to you, that's 40 bits. You looking at that slide is another 40 bits. So you can see that if you're even doing one other thing, you're in overload. So it's very important that you focus attention on the key things that you want to in order to get the outcomes. If you've got a to-do list of 200, what you choose to focus on is what becomes an experience for you. The second one is about the marshmallow. And you've all probably heard about this experiment where they actually did this with 5-year-old kids, where they actually gave them, put a marshmallow in front of them, and they said if they waited for 15 minutes or 10 minutes, I think it was, they get 2. Now, a third of the kids actually waited for 20 minutes to get the 2 marshmallows. Now, what's the big story here? It's beyond self-control. Obviously, it's about self-control, but it's also the fact that you actually need to understand how, because they didn't defeat their desire, they just distracted themselves. And that is, again, the key thing. You can't control what happens to you in life, but you can certainly control your response to it. And that is what this is about. And the third one in terms of focused attention is this lovely word mindfulness that we use a lot nowadays. What is mindfulness? Moment-to-moment awareness, especially non-judgmental awareness. And that's difficult. Nothing's good or bad in this world, it just is. But how do you actually put that into practice? And John Kabat-Zinn actually said that the world is awesome, it's awe-provoking, it's inspiring if we show up for it and pay attention to the particulars. Wherever you are, be there. And that's what focused attention is about, is what do you shine your light on? How do you respond to the world? And how do you continuously be present?
Excellent. So I'm going to cover the next two dimensions quickly, even though there are lots of pictures there. The second dimension is this thing called the collaborative spirit. See, human beings are the only species that actually uses collaboration as a strategy to meet the challenges of existence. Among primates, we are the most excessive users of cooperation and collaboration. And for that, we've got some psychological mechanisms, we got some massive computational power that we bring to bear. So how does this work? Very, very quickly. So the one big thing you do is that you do favors today on the basis that, hey, the person I'm doing a favor to is going to return it to me in some future time. So this is that whole communal and collaborative search for solutions to life's challenges based on the reciprocity rule, that if I help you today, then you're going to help me tomorrow. And the way I enforce that reciprocity is by being very grateful to you when you do return the favor, and being quite vengeful when you don't. But as you can see, the main story is not there in the reciprocity rule. The main story then is that if you are actually going to be happy in this existence, you want to be able to choose friends who are very trustworthy and very meritorious for being in your coalition, so that you can do favors for them and you can be reasonably sure that they're going to do favors back. Now, we use emotional and cognitive mechanisms to make sure that we make trustworthy friends. So collaborative spirit is all about saying that when it comes to life's challenges, we pick the strategy of friendships to achieve success. And what are some of the emotional mechanisms? Well, language, gossip, and of course, synchrony, communal dancing and communal prayers and get-togethers, etc., etc. And what are the cognitive mechanisms? It's theory of mind. My ability not just to know what I am thinking at any time, but also being able to travel in time, space, and identity to understand what you are thinking, so that you and I can be good friends. Now, the big question is, does this work with social media? Ash has been talking about social media. In social media, by 2014, which was the 10th year anniversary for Facebook, the average Facebook user had more than 348. I think it was roughly, the median number was 438 friends. When they looked at 96 million Twitter users in 2016, there were folks that were well past 500. And there was, of course, the Kardashians who were well past 1 million. And then when you look at LinkedIn, for example, the big thing that LinkedIn tells you is that, hey, make friends. Once you've hit 500, we won't even show people how many friends you have because you're so special. Now, here's the key. There is absolutely no difference between friendships in the real world and friendships on social media. You've got a fixed amount of social capital. You can either disperse it intensively, narrowly, deeply connecting with people, or you can spread it widely and very, very surface. And guess what? In the end, when you have a crisis, it's only the first 4 or 5 people that you know really, really well that are going to come to help. The third dimension is collective wisdom. And I'm going to try and bring this to a close now. Collective wisdom says that this phenomenon of connections depends on this phenomenon of connections depends on augmented capacity. What is that? All the evidence from psychology and neuroscience and meditative practice shows that you can augment, you can expand your individual capacity amazingly. Not just your capacity to work, not just your capacity to produce, but also your intelligence amazingly in communion. Right? I mean, in emotional intelligence, they call it neural Wi-Fi. And when people are there, when they're emotionally connected, then all of a sudden they have what is called synchrony. It's like synchronized swimming. Their actions, thoughts, behaviors, and emotions resonate, and they suddenly get power and capability that's far beyond anything that they would have had individually. There's a lot more around this in the book. Yeah. And finally, there's this area of smartness, which comes with, and the area of smartness basically says that when it comes, in this movie called, I forget the name, Tommy Lee Jones and what was that?
Independence Day.
Independent, yeah. They're talking about, Tommy Lee Jones says, hey, individuals are smart, people are dumb, stupid, panicky animals. Quite the opposite. All the research in collective wisdom shows that crowds are very smart.
Okay, so having finished the futures mindset, we then move into the 5 ways of being, which, as you can see, is really the key part of the book. The 5 ways of being are ways in which these mindsets can be created. So the futures mindset, the 3 dimensions of the futures mindsets are brought to life by these 5 ways of being. And the 5 ways of being are being present, being good, being in touch, being creative, and being inclusive. Now, we're not going to go into all of that today because that would take a very, very long time, and then you wouldn't buy the book.
There you go.
So what we are going to do is just pause now for a few questions, some comments, before we actually come back with some final thoughts. So I'm going to just throw it off to Zahra now for her to take us through that.
Thank you, Mr. Vikram and Ms. Asha, for the wonderful and insightful talk. I certainly enjoyed it. We have a comment from one of the participants by the name of Carol. He or she mentions that it's true about adaptability. Many leaders think they are ahead of the curve, prepared to create lasting change. Yes. But the reality is that there's often a preconceived endpoint. And this is where the iConnected paradigm steps in to disrupt this unhelpful thinking.
Absolutely, Terrell, you're preaching to the converted. Maybe I should have written a book with you too, yeah?
Yeah. So anyone who has any questions, please feel free to post it on the chat box. We have received one question before this meeting, which is, which guiding canon would you rank as most challenging for leaders?
Okay, I think Asha and I are in complete, vehement agreement on this one, and that is the beginner's mind. When you look at when you look at this whole area of expertise and beginner's mind, organizations love experts, and each one of you wants to be an expert. I want to be an expert. Which one of us hasn't been sitting in an office and the young Turk comes in and says, boss, I got a problem. And you stand up and say, no worries, I've got the answer. So all of us love to have answers. But the core issue there is that an expert, how does anybody become an expert? A guy called Sussman in 1973 talks about that. All right. You become an expert how? by looking back on when you did that activity before, understanding what you did right, understanding what you did incorrectly, picking the pitfalls that you saw when you did that thing correctly, and making sure you don't fall into the same pitfalls again. Now, the big thing with that is that, so when do you become a complete expert? You become a complete expert when you understand the routine so well. It's so deeply embedded in you, the answer and the way to solve a particular problem, that you don't even think when the problem presents itself. Now, this is a superb way to be when today looks like yesterday. But if today is very different from yesterday, then you're going to act with yesterday's routines and create the chaos of tomorrow.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other one too is the challenging one. All of them are, all of the canons, but the other one is about the alert attention, because that is a very difficult one in today's world, when you have multiple things hitting you all the time, hitting your senses all the time, hitting your news feeds all the time, your notifications, how do you actually deeply engage? Quite often leaders will ask us this, what can I do? Can I shut the door? How do I shut off my email? How do I, and many times we do things like, oh, we'll just, this weekend, I'm not looking at my email. But it doesn't work, because the world comes in, it floods in. And that's why that is another challenge in terms of a canon, is alert attention. So the beginner's mind and alert attention are probably the two most challenging aspects for leaders in an iConnected world, because of the pace of change, the rate of change. I mean, change has always happened, but not quite at the same rate.
Thank you, Vikram and Aasha Murthy. We have another question from the audience by the name Gayatri. She asked, we are not autonomous as leaders and have to culturally fit into the corporate culture of the company we work in. What is your view when there is such a conflict in our own styles of leadership and the companies?
Yeah, Gayatri, it's a fabulous question. And, there are 2 chapters in the book that talk about this. And, you've hit the nub of one of the core ways of being, which is being inclusive. And one of the big tenets of being inclusive is the fact that leadership is culturally contingent. Organizations have their own leadership culture, and generally societies have, regions have, countries have, so leadership is very culturally contingent. And I must say, since Aasha is a woman, you're a woman too, Gayatri, I think I need to add that some of the prevailing templates for contingent leadership, unfortunately, are quite male dominated. So, if you are a woman going to lead an organization where the dominant implicit leadership theory in everybody's mind is that, I need a man running this, and all the male related dominant characteristics, you're going to be in big trouble.
The other side of that is, what do you do then? And I think that's where the wise responses, right? So when you are in an environment that is either changed or it's in conflict with your own value system, so you can do 3 things. These are the wise responses. 1, you can adapt yourself to fit in with the environment, or you can shape the environment to fit in with you, which is not always possible if you're not running the show, or you select to leave. So I think it's adapt, shape,
or ship
out. Now, again, that's easier said than done, obviously, because, we need to work for a variety of reasons, but that's the way to do it. I mean, you have to adapt in some ways, and hopefully find an organization which does resonate with your own values.
Did that
Thank
help,
you,
guys?
Vikram and Asha. So we have a few more questions from the audience. I'm going to combine 2 or 3 questions together. The
Sure.
first is, are strategic plans of any use? And from your point of view, and in a few words, how would you prepare yourself to become a successful leader? And what will be the future's leadership style?
Okay.
You could take
We
the
could
strategy one.
we could almost write one more book there, huh? But no. So let's look at strategy. Okay. I mean, because how do most organizations work their strategy? Eh, Fortunately or unfortunately, most of them do contingency planning. Many of you are used to making business plans where you take last year's plan and add 10% to it, or subtract 10% from it, and make the following year's plan. And a lot of us do this contingency stuff, where we do SWOT analysis and all those, those templates that have kind of got baked in into the way we run strategy. But if you distill strategy to its core, I'm sorry, I don't know who asked this question, Zahra, but I hope I'm addressing them. But when you distill strategy to its core, it's about one of 2 things. It's about being better or being different. All right. And then being better or being different, paradigms tell us the ways of being either of these 2 things. So in the old paradigm, there were all those sustainable competitive advantage stories. There were all those strategy as activating stories, and there was resource-based competition, and so on and so forth. And then you come to what we call the iConnected paradigm. And all of a sudden, those rules aren't so good anymore. Why? Because you need to have a prescient view of the future. And to have a prescient view of the future, you not just need to be able to pick stuff that is known, but you also need to pick stuff that's knowable. You need to pick stuff where your cause and its effect are separated in time and space. And finally, you need to pick action in the future, which are long fuse big bang, meaning that you may be doing stuff today that will finally show results 30 years from now. I will give you an example that may probably, tell my age, but in 1995, there was the Comdex show in Atlanta, Georgia, and there were 2 big marquee events. There was this guy called Bill Gates, and he was talking about Windows, Windows 95. And there was this guy called Bill Frankenberg, and he was talking about neural networks. One guy was saying that all the power was going to be in the device, and the other guy was saying all the power was going to be in the network. As you know, these are long fuse big bangs. One guy became a multi-billionaire. The other guy, I don't think any of you even know his name. So there you go.
So in terms of leadership, what kind of a leader you need to be, what is a style? I think it's the greatest style you can have is actually no style in
Correct.
an iConnected world, because it is different based on the situation, based on the context. Remember, we talked about it's a world that's populated by millennials. There's social media, which is moving so quickly. It's a VUCA world. It's got global risks. So really, if you have a baked-in style of leadership, you've already lost. I think it's all about flex. It's all about being adaptive and moving and letting go. And that's what we talked about earlier. It's agility, it's mindfulness, it's paying attention. These are the things that are going to be enable you to succeed in a world that is changing so fast.
Absolutely. Zahra,
Thank you, Asha and Vikram. So due to time constraints, we will have to come to an end to today's webinar. So if there are any more questions, we will take it offline and get back to the people that have asked questions on the chat today.
Sure.
So thank you all for attending, and Dr. Vikram and Ms. Asha for taking the time to share with us your wonderful insights and thoughts. Thank you all, and wish you all a good day.
Great
Thank
stuff.
you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Anna.
very much.
Thank you, everybody.